So in this lesson, we have a live job that we're going to out one of our customers, and I'm going to do this in Stitch and Sew the way I would do any professional design. So first, we'll go back and forth between our little whiteboard here. I'm using Word as a whiteboard, so we can look at strategy and then look how and then we'll switch back to the program to see how we actually get this done. So before you actually go to your digitizing program, the first thing you want to do is get the best information from your customer possible. The first thing is the best quality image that you can, digital or on paper. Of course, if it's on paper, then you're going to have to either photograph it or scan it in. The size that it's going to be embroidered, because the size that it is, and you'll see in a little bit, will affect completely how you do it. And finally, the type of garment or fabric, because that also affects how you do it too, that it's going to be sewn on. So the next thing I would do is import the so what we're going to do is import the graphic using image, create, and then import image. So, and then the important thing is you want to set the size of the image in the program to the embroidered size. So let's see how we do this. So let's switch over to our program view. Okay, so what we're going to do is go to, again, create and then import image. And this one happens to be a customer design, so I'm going to bring this up and let's find this thing here. Okay, so this image was going to be 2x3 or 2x4, and she had said it's going to be on onto a sweatshirt. So first of all, let's go ahead and show some information here. When you have your Stitch and Sew program, you're going to have a ruler under Tools. So I'm going to show the ruler, which is my little measuring tape here. You can also do it by clicking here. And then, of course, I can show a grid. You want to show all of your measurement tools here, so you can glance and see how big this is. So here also, here's a ruler here, and you can see that this came in at about 2 inches wide. And then if I actually, and I'll go ahead and hide this grid. We're going to use that later. And also using our tape measuring tool, it will tell me at the bottom here how big that is in inches. So you can see that the distance right here is how long that line is. So it's my tape measure, and showing me that's about 2.9 inches. So, and then we can even use this again. I'll tap letter Q. That's another way of doing it, bringing it across and making sure. And this should be about 2 inches, 2.3. So requested size is 2x4. This is 2x3. So that's close. If we needed to change the size, then you can import it again, go to create and import image. And let's say we want it to come in at twice that size, then just double this size here. It's saying it's going to come in at 2 and change, which is what we measured here. But notice that we noticed that it was a little bit taller than 3 inches, but it's saying this is a lot higher than 4 1/4. Obviously, this looks like an iPhone capture. So you're going to see some images where the artwork's not just, the size of the artwork is not just the image you're going to digitize, but maybe some surrounding icons or graphics or background. So the program always counts the entire background. So if you're concerned that your actual subject that's going to be digitized about its size, and you have a bigger canvas area, then you want to guess a little bit accordingly. So if I want my owl, for example, here to be 3 inches tall, then what I want to do is then I want to kind of, and we know that this is about 3, then that's fine. But let's say we wanted 6, and we know that's 3, then we can't just make the second number 6. We want to, and to change that number, we click on this button, and we can't just make that second number 6. We have to make it 6 and change. So So I'm going to guess 7, and you can make a few guesses, and within a couple guesses you can get it pretty close. Hit OK, and again, pretending our owl needs to be 6 inches tall, you can see now that this is 4 inches wide versus a little over 2. And if I measure this again with my tape measure and look down at the bottom number here, it's showing me that that is right at 4 3/4. So I need to go even bigger. So just do it again, create import image, and we'll select it. And instead of going 7 or whatever, let's try something like maybe 7 3/4. Hit OK until it's correct. And then just a quick remeasure. And then you want to make a note of how big you made that. We can do math and everything, proportional math, to calculate this out, but I'm often pretty good at just making a guess. Well, 7 3/4 didn't do it, so create import image. If we wanted, again, pretending we want it to be our bird graphic to be 6 inches tall, let's try 8.5 and see if that does it.
I have a question. If you
Sure.
import, like I bought some embroidery designs offline. If I import them, can I make them bigger the same way that you're doing, or do I just need to make them, enlarge them on the screen?
Actually, I've got some good news for you. So good question. Let's say that a legitimate part of digitizing is that you may get a digitized design already and then bring it in and maybe add some text or delete a part of it or just combine it with something else. So what we can do is, let's go ahead and open a new design here, and we'll leave that aside and we'll continue on in a moment. But what we can do is let's open a stock design. So let me see if I can't find some kind of let's say they're typically in DST, and you brought up a pretty good point. So I'm just going to try and find some small logo here, that some small DST design. Hopefully we can find, all right, something simple like this. This is a DST file, and this comes in. If we open that, it'll even tell us file open design. And let's find that one again. So I think it was bob.dst for whatever reason. Okay, so it will show you that it's 1.4 inches wide by ½ an inch tall. So, and we can even confirm that by looking at this way. Now, what I was showing you, if you want to resize artwork, is you go to create, import image, and it only resizes the image that you trace on. But to resize it, like you said, the way to do it is you can drag it a little bit bigger if you want to, and then it'll show you the new size here as you're doing it. Or what I would do if it's a DST design, DST designs, when you make something bigger, you need to add stitches to it to fill in the gaps and keep consistent density. But Stitch and Sew won't do it by letting you drag it. So instead, grab whatever you're doing and then go to Design and click Change Size. And make note of the stitch count. It's 1,064 stitches. But let's say they want it 2 inches across, or let's say they want it 3/4 inch high, so 0.75. And notice it's calculating the other number, and you want to hit Activate Stitch Processor. And when we hit OK, and just before we do, you're going to see that that stitch count at 1,064 will change. So I'll go and hit OK. It got bigger. You can see, if I look at it at a glance, just kind of drag it over here, you can see that's 3/4 inches tall, but also it added about 200 stitches to the total stitch count to keep it consistent. So that's the answer for you. If you want resize a design, yeah, just bring it in, select it, and go to Design, and then Change Size, and do it that way. So awesome. Great question. Yep. All right. So now, if we are digitizing, though, like what we were talking about earlier, is that we're creating it from scratch. So whatever we create, we can just drag and resize, and it will automatically adjust the stitch count as we're going. So remember, the customer wanted this at 3 inches tall approximately, so we can actually bring this in. We were found earlier ignoring our exercise, that it actually comes in at the correct height. So, and again, quick verification, between 2 inches tall wide, so that's about 2.3, and then by about 2.9 inches tall. So that's right in that zone, and we can start next from there. So once we brought it in at the size we need to, is I would add into step 2 and evaluate the image based on the size of the various design elements. And what that means is look at the different parts of the design. In this case, it's going to be just the owl, but we want to look at how big the area is. Now, the instruction for me is that we're really only going to do the outlines and we're not going to fill it in. But what we want to look for is we want to look at the width and how big that's going to be, how wide or how thick that line is going to be. And the fast way to do that is go to View and then Show the Grid, which we saw earlier in this recording. And what you want to do is show your grid and then make the grid, it's a very specific size. You go to Tools, set your grid size, and make it 0.04 inches. If you're in inches here, then make it 0.04 inches. And that makes each grid square about the width of the hole that a standard 7511 needle makes. And what you want to make sure is that if you're going to make any kind of stitching that fills in a path or a stem, like a vine, a branch, a border, like this shape here, or even lettering, it's usually done with what's called satin stitching. So one important question we're going to answer here is we're going to use the grid, set it up, and use a 1 millimeter grid to see what parts of the design can be satin stitching. So we're in the middle of doing that, so we want to zoom in and measure the width of the stems. And when I mean measure sounds like a lot of trouble, but with a grid you can glance and basically guess. Satin stitches must be at least 1 millimeter wide and no wider than about 10 millimeters. So 1 millimeter is, of course, really tiny. 10 millimeters is getting just shy of a half an inch. Half an inch is 13 millimeters. Really, most digitizers will stop at about a quarter inch, which is about 7 millimeters. So what does that mean when we have an image here? Basically, you use the grid and make sure that if you're going to make a satin stitch, and a satin stitch is done with the freeform tool, or I'm sorry, with the column tool. The way we digitize in a digitizing program is you trace the shape of the artwork, and then once you trace the shape, you go into stitch mode and tell it, I want to apply whatever kind of stitch. In this case, this is a column that will result in a satin stitch. And then I'm going to tell it where I want it to begin. And I'll even make it the color of the background here so you can see it going on, sort of this dark gold, and tell it where I want it to end. And now I see my stitching here. So, and I want to make this a satin stitch really quick, and we'll just leave it as a satin stitch. Okay, so the way you want to do typical borders and lettering, I'm going to move this aside, is you want to do it as a satin stitch, where it goes back and forth and back and forth. But if this gets too narrow, less than a millimeter, then if you can imagine, if a grid square is the size of the hole that a needle makes, and if we zoom in really closely, then anywhere that there's a stitch point here, I'm going to set up these black dots here so you can see, or anywhere there's a stitch point here, it's going to actually make a hole that size, and then it's going to move over, make a hole this size. So we want to be at least at full millimeter apart, or full grid block apart, so that when the needle comes out of here and goes to this next stitch, that it's moving over at least far enough to make a completely different hole and not just make the hole bigger. So That's why you can't make a stitch narrower than a millimeter.
Okay.
So when you view a grid, you don't have to think much. All you have to do is look and say, is this stem wider than a block? If it is, then you can make it into this kind of stitch. So whether you digitize or not, an important thing that this is telling you is this logo too small to digitize? Are the lines too thin to make this kind of nice satin stitch that looks like this? So you're making a snap decision just based on looking at the grid and making sure the line detail is at least a millimeter wide. Now, if we blew this up, let's look at something really quick. And let's find another image that might have a different kind of problem. Let's say that this logo is going to be a full jacket back and it says Eats on it. And so if it was going to be a big jacket back, then let's say this is going to be about 13 inches wide, which accommodates for this white space here on either side of the logo. And now we've got the word Eats, and it's going to, normally you would make a satin stitch going back and forth, just like I did, where I'm going to digitize using the column tool. A satin stitch, we'll make that a satin stitch. And again, we're going to draw the shape, and don't worry about how we draw that. We'll show that next. But we're just going to draw the shape, and the stitches are going to kind of follow around, going back and forth like this. So, but if I have my grid, then I can count and say, well, this is, remember, this is a jacket back, so I blew it way up. So this is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Remember, most digitizers won't make a satin stitch wider than about 7 millimeters. This is already at 8 right here, 9, 10, 11, 12. This is way too wide to be a satin stitch. So this is going to have to be a fill stitch. If I make it a satin stitch, I'm going to make a quick sample satin stitch here. Let me make it in this color. Then, oops, I put a pattern in there. Hang on a second. Okay. Oh, edit. Now we can do this. Okay. So this is going to be a satin stitch, but this is going to be so wide that it's loose. You don't even have to sew that out to know. All you needed to know is that you turn on a grid, and then going from one side of the letter to the other, or one side of the stem to the other, if you're more than 1, 2, 3, 4, about 7 grid blocks, 8, 9, 10 grid blocks wide before you get to the other side, then you can't make an uninterrupted thread that's not anchored in the middle. So that cannot be a satin stitch. It's going to wind up being very loose when you sew it out. So instead, you would fill in that large area with a fill stitch. Go ahead.
Can you use a step satin where it
Yes, exactly. So you look, sounds like you're doing your homework. So that's exactly what we're going to do. Is we'll do exactly the same thing. In other words, I don't have to really draw this over. This is I'm just going to show you how I would do it, knowing in advance that that's way too wide to be a satin stitch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my stitch type, and like you said, go to step satin. You're exactly right, and hit apply, and that's going to become the type of stitch that I put in here. Now you'll notice that it looks very different from the type of stitch that we created with satin stitch. Maybe it's not as pretty and smooth, especially if I zoom out a little bit, but there's a pattern in there, and that pattern of needle penetration points going down the middle keeps it nice and stable. So this is going to be loose because it's well over 1/4 inch long. This is going to be this letter will be nice and stable. It won't puff up as much, and plus you'll have a much higher stitch count, but it will sew out nicely. It won't give you any physical problems.
Okay.
So that's as a contrast. So going back to our little digitizing plan, so satin stitches must be at least 1 millimeter wide and no wider than 10 millimeters. So if the area you're covering with stitches is over 10 millimeters wide, use a step satin, which is generically in the industry called a fill stitch, instead to cover it.
Okay.
So you're basically making a decision. Go ahead. What were you saying?
No, I didn't realize it was one of the same step.
Okay.
Okay.
And fill, right. The step satin is actually a little bit different because the step satin, so it is not exactly the same. What it is this behaves like a satin stitches and it flows at one angle, but as it goes around a corner, it changes angles, flowing a lot like a satin stitch. And plus you can draw it exactly the same way you did a satin stitch, except that we're going to put a fill pattern in. But I'll show you another way of doing it. Let's view the image again. Is you can actually, instead of using the column tool, which we've been using this whole time to create it, we're going to use the freeform tool, and we'll trace the edges a lot like the way we did it with the column tool. And again, I'm just doing one part of the letter. But instead, I'm going to, of course, fill it in. This is going to be a step. This is going to be a step satin by default, and it's going to ask me for the angle. It says input the direction, which let's say I want the angle to be about 45 degrees, and then it says input the entry point. So like I've been doing with the other two, I'll set where I want to set the first stitch, and then it'll say now input the exit point. So when I click that, it tells me where I want to put the last stitch, and as soon as I do that, it will build stitching on here. But notice what it does. That looks pretty similar, but if we zoom in a little bit more closely, you'll notice, and I'll hide the artwork here, is that the stitch direction on this is uniform and flat. There's no curve, whereas this one does have a curve to it. So that's kind of a hybrid satin stitch where it turns like a satin, but it's not. And it turns like a satin, but on this one, this is only one angle. So on curves, you definitely want to do one flat. Generally, just large areas, do it this second way here, which is using the freeform tool. So going to our little plan is so if your areas that are too wide for a satin stitch, use a step satin and use the freeform tool to draw it. So.
Okay. Now, do you have to put underlay stitches on that, or does it?
Very good question. So let's go ahead and, so if it can be a satin stitch, you're going to use the column tool to create them. If you're using the fill stitch, then you're going to use the freeform tool. So that gives you actually the basis for just creating just about any shape. And yes, you are talking about things like underlay. And you can actually see this here that automatically created some underlay here. It created a slightly different kind of underlay here. You can see that underneath. So, and even slightly different underlay. Well, similar underlay. This is called an edge walk underlay here. So what's it doing and why did it do two different kinds of underlay? Because I didn't obviously do anything, especially that you saw me talk about. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't do anything. It just picked its own underlay. So let's talk about what the program's doing when we do that. And if you right click in the program and choose embroidery settings, it's going to show you all the things that it's going to do when you draw a shape and how it's going to fill that in with stitching. So if you get to know all the stats here, or are what are called stitch settings, this is basically the little formula on how to fill that in with stitching. And if you put all the information in here the way you want it, then it's going to set up three things, primarily underlay, something called pull compensation, and also stitch density here, the way you prefer it. Now, we haven't set any preferences, so what's going on is the program has its own default values. And in fact, if I don't want these default values, I want it to be, I'm sewing on, let's say, a sweatshirt, then what I can do, the default values, first of all, are going to be whatever. For a satin stitch, obviously, it puts an edge walk underlay under here. and let's see what else it does. I'm going to select it and see what else it's doing. If I go to editing, it's showing me it's setting a density of 3, a central underlay and an edge walk underlay, and then 10% stretch, or what's called pull compensation. So it's going to set whatever the default value is. So if I create another one of these satin stitches, I'm going to do it exactly this way. So what if we want to change that? Or even better, why learn that right now when we're focusing on digitizing? So I recommend for the first time digitizer is don't worry about any of these settings. Draw your artwork, but when you're done, what you do is go to design, and you want to save it, but before you save it, hit apply fabric, and you're going to see a list of different types of fabric, and pick the one that's closest to what you're actually going to sew on. So the nice lady who gave me this job to do is wanting to do this on a sweatshirt. So let's just find a sweatshirt like this one. And you want to decide, is it fleece, is it heavy jersey, is it medium jersey? So it's just fall coming up, so we're going to assume a medium jersey. In other words, not a super thick sweatshirt. And I'm going to hit OK, and watch what happens when I hit OK. And also look at the stitch count at 3,701. I'm going to click OK and watch the stitch groups first of all. I'm going to hit OK right now. And you notice there were some things that changed a little bit. The underlay got a little more dense here. There's probably a little bit more density here. But actually, we went down by about 200 stitches. The important thing is you saw a change in the stitch count. Things look a little different. The program did some things automatically for that kind of fabric. So that's the most important thing. So I would say for stitch settings, beginners can rely on the preset fabrics to automatically set underlay, stretch, which is pull compensation. And stretch basically is just shape compensation for anticipated shrinkage and distortion that's kind of known when it sews on different kinds of fabrics. So it can typically is going to boldface satin stitching, make it a little bit wider, because typically on certain types of garments, you're going to get some shrinkage in certain directions. So the stretch takes care of that. And finally, stitch density.
And where do you click to get that, where you put the type of fabric?
So you're going to click that under design,
under design.
Then apply fabric.
Okay.
And choose a garment or a fabric type similar to what's going to be what it's going to be sewn on. Okay. Seems like I'm writing a book, but we're actually condensing a lot here. So we've got good strategy here is that as you're drawing, you're going to decide if it's going to be a satin stitch or if it's going to be a fill stitch based on the size of the design element. So getting back to our graphic here, we've decided a few things. That this can be a satin stitch, and we also know it's going to be a sweatshirt. So, so what I'm going to do is, the next thing you want to decide though is, now that I know that I can pretty much do all of this in satin stitching, I want to make a couple of other decisions. The other thing is that I want to, these are a lot of interacting lines, and you want to decide what line goes on top of what. Because embroidery is 3D, and if we printed this, it won't matter if this wing prints and then this head prints. But for example here, if we quote unquote print the leg, this owl's right leg, and then we print the body of the owl, it's going to look one way. But if we print, or in this case embroider, the body of the owl and its left leg here, then we embroider the right leg on top of that. First of all, I don't know anything about this logo, but use your intuition. You can kind of guess that if this is probably the further away leg, because the body line covers over the top of that leg. So those that little line detail says this is probably underneath or behind the body. So in embroidery, that is very important to make it look nice. And it gives you, if you pay attention to it, it gives you more dimensionality that you wouldn't see in a flat graphic. And that's often why people will pay more for embroidery than they would for a printing, is because you'll get that depth. So what you're going to worry about here is also evaluate the design. So the images, depth or layering, and decide the sewing sequence of each element of the design.
Okay.
So you've kind of figured that out as probably the things that are further away from us we want to sew first. So in this case, probably the owl's right leg. The wing looks like it's going to be on top. The head looks like it's about level with the wing, maybe just behind the wing, but the body looks like it's next. After the body on the left leg look like they come after the right leg. So we can kind of establish that. So since this is the first thing that looks like it's going to sew, then let's go ahead and start with that. So whatever you create first is going to sew first, and then whatever sews last, edges are going to be on top of whatever sewed first, and therefore whatever sewed last looks like it's on top. So we'll go ahead and create our satin stitch. I'm going to go to the column tool, and I'm going to draw. And this is now what I'm about to do is a little bit more advanced or intermediate, but I'm going to draw the angles of this where it's going to meet here, so that it kind of meets where the angle is going to be of the satin stitch that it's going to bleed into here. So, and I'm just going to follow this around, and as you're drawing, if you get something wrong, you can always adjust the shape a little bit. You can even move your mouse points if you want to, and also never be afraid to zoom in a little bit. The more that you can zoom in, the more accurate your drawing is going to be. All right. I shouldn't have to work that hard, but, and then the other thing is this owl, I'm going to go to the leg next, or I guess his little calf or his shin or his knee. So I'm going to do something else. I'm going to hit delete so that I can actually undo my last points, and I'm going to draw something else. This is me being kind of an advanced digitizer here by drawing what I call an overlap tab, which you'll see in a moment what it does. And again, I'm going to run this into the body in a way that the angle is going to blend. I'm making, by drawing the way these pairs are, and this also instructs the program to make the stitches go at that angle by the time they pass through here. So in other words, this is maybe at this angle, but by the time it gets here, it's a slightly different angle. It's going to average the stitches out to a curve between the two like that. So, all right. So I've drawn my shape. I want to start here and then end and stop here, because then I want to go here, and then I want to sew this, and then I want to sew this, and then kind of do the body next. So that's what I kind of guessed informally by looking at the layering. So I'm going to hit stitch it. I want to tell it, first of all, I want to make it this color. So I just kind of click on the color swatch, and then click on a color that makes it that color. I think I already picked it, but that looks a little bit dark. So again, I just click on the swatch, and I can kind of pick a color. Let's make it a little bit lighter. And I'll go ahead and it's asking me for my entry point, so I want to start here. And then I wanted to sew all this, but then wind up over here. So I'm going to put my exit point, which it's asking for, down here. So now it's going to sew here, up to here, and then walk on up here, sew back so that it meets up where I told it to end up. All right. There's a reason why I made this tab, is because all this is going to shrink away from that leg a little bit. So I don't want what do you call it, a gap to appear here. So I just kind of made it overlap a little bit. And then I'm just going to continue on creating this. Let's stitch it. I'm going to start where I left off and end where I'm going to. Oh, and that made a fill stitch for some reason. So I want to set my default so it's always going to be a satin stitch, so I don't have to worry about this. And simpler shapes like this, I don't even have to draw as many points, although I do want to kind of overlap here a little bit. Just the way I did over here, I'm going to put a little tab up here. And I'm going to finish my point right over here like this. See how you can kind of adjust your shape on the fly. Hit stitch it. It's going to ask for my endpoint again. I want to start where I left off and end where I want to wind up. And for some reason that, I forgot to hit default. I'll show you how to change the default so I don't have to keep doing that, because that put a fill stitch there. Now I change it back to a satin stitch. All right, create this leg. So go back to column tool again. And the program should actually stay in column tool mode as we stay in digitizing, so you don't have to press as many buttons unusually. So that's my next shape. I'm going to hit stitch it, start where I left off, and where I want to go. And before I do, I'm going to, before you create anything, go to your preferred stitch type for whatever shape you're going to hit and hit apply. That means from now on, anything that you create using whatever tool, in this case the column tool, will be, that will be its preference. So it'll always do your preferred stitch type. And then I'm going to put my exit point. Now that's everything's coming out automatically as a satin stitch. So you see the order that we did. We made this first, then I made this tab. It doesn't look like this is underneath it because these are about the same level. But then I dug into this. I overlapped into here, knowing that this is going to cover that over. But I want these two legs to look the same, so I made this overlap a little bit here so that then this could be covered over. That's basically all a pro digitizer is thinking about, is they're thinking about how each little piece is going to interact. Now, this is tricky here because I've got a V, and I'm going to show you that if I create, I'll just draw one little shape at this. Sharp angles have problems that normal angles don't. Like this is kind of a normal angle. It's not terribly sharp. And this is even a normal angle here. But when I get to a little sharp angle like this will actually look nice. But hopefully we can see the kind of problem when we do this. I'm going to draw that shape. And I could continue all the way around, but I just want to give you a quick example. I'll set my start point, and over here it'll default to a satin stitch because I set up my default. This gets really long, and you really don't want to bunch things like this. So an alternate trick, and this is a more of an intermediate trick, is that you're going to digitize that in a different way in a couple different overlapping pieces, so it doesn't make this turn. The stitches are kind of meld into each other. So sharp angles can be done a different way in what's called a mitered corner. But I want to go over here. Let's see. I want the wing to sew last, so I want to go on over there and sew this first, then come back around and then have it wind up at the head of the owl. So so what I'm going to do is what's called a pathing stitch. I don't want the machine to stop and cut and then move over here and sew that. I just want to run all the way over to here and then start. So if I'm in digitizing mode, and if you have the plus system, you can hit the insert key, which is nice, and then you can click like this, and these become your stitches. Oh, maybe I want that more centered here, so I'll move that a little bit more clean. So this is what's called tunneling. I want to go to my next stitch location, or where I'm going to start my next satin stitch, by walking here, because this is going to be covered up in a moment. because the stitches will, and I just hit enter, and that's my stitching. Now I'm going to create with the column tool. Draw my shape. And remember the corner I was talking about here, I kind of want to draw that and stop and start a new shape. So that's kind of what I'm going to do is I'm going to overlap partly. Zoom in. Always zoom in when you can, because your work is a lot more precise when you zoom in, and just zoom out from time to time to check your work. So I'm going to run this like this. And you can always fine tune your shapes if you want to. And we can even fine tune this after you create it, get as perfect as you want to. Oops. And I'll really fine tune this later, but this is a nice glance at how simple it is. Just kind of grab an edge and move it around until it's exactly where your artwork is. Then I hit stitch it, set my starting point. In this case, the start point is where I left off here with this running stitch. Then I'm going to end it over here. And then what I'm going to do is my next shape that'll take over, that'll take me to the rest of the body of the owl with my column tool. I'm just going to kind of bleed in partly like that. Try to put them at the same angle. And this winds up being better looking than actually trying to make the stitches turn. So as long as you kind of overlap in, try to put them at a similar angle, then that's kind of an old digitizer's trick.
So you kind of miter it there.
Right, exactly. I'm mitering it a little bit, exactly. So it sounds like this is not your first rodeo when it comes to digitizing
well,
at all.
The digitizing, yes, but I've done draperies and pillows for 25 years, so.
Gotcha. So this is nothing new to you at all. So.
It's just learning to do, which this has been an amazing lesson.
Well, I'm glad this is useful for you, because this is Stitch and Sew is not as expensive as a lot of high-end digitizing systems, but it does have all these nice little features that let you really make sure that the stitches flow nicely the way they ought to. And with your experience, it sounds like it's just a matter of learning for you how
to do this on
how to do it in this program, right? So here's another challenging intersection. So what I'm going to do is I'm just kind of miter, or actually just kind of half bleed into it. And then by the time this path meets it, I want to make sure it goes far enough that it completely overlaps. So that's probably far enough. If I did it here, for example, then it might come over here and there'll be a gap. So I want to kind of do it up here. Of course, that messes up my line here, but I can always fine tune that a little bit. So it's much easier when you zoom in. And to change from corner to curve, hold down the control key and just click multiple times. There's perfect corner, perfect curve, hybrid corner, or hybrid curve, hybrid corner. So just pick the one that matches, and after that you can still play with the wireframe between each point so that you can get it really kind of perfect. So that's drawn the way I want it to, and I'm going to go ahead and hit stitch it, and I'm going to start where I left off with this last stitch. So you always want to be aware of where the last stitch was that you created, and then end up here. And then you can kind of basically go from there. This would be a continuous shape over here, and so it really doesn't matter where I start. These aren't hard angles, so this is going to be a fairly easy shape to digitize. I'm just kind of draw the pairs. And just follow it all the way around. But there's one trick here that is really nice, is when I want to draw a continuous satin stitch that doesn't really have a start and really doesn't have an end, then there's a trick that I can do to link both ends together. See how I created a little overlap tab here, so when the wing sews, that's not going to leave a gap. Yep, and I want to curve that right there. I want to clean this up and make this really look nice. If I do this right, I can get my homework done for our customer here before I during this lesson and kill two birds with one stone. But this is actually a pretty good lesson. Like this is when you're drawing a closed shape with no that is continuous with no end. When you approach the other end like this, what you do is, I don't have to draw any more points. I just really want to link this. Press the 0 key, and that links them both. So that's the trick to doing, whether you want to enclose the shape to do a fill stitch or a step satin like you said, or you want to go ahead, or you just want to do a continuous satin stitch like this. All right, so, and all I have to do is hit stitch it, set where I want to start, then I want to end up over here by the wing. And we're
Now,
pretty much almost done. Go
are
ahead.
you right clicking to make that those stop and start points?
I'm left clicking. So
Oh,
all I do is when I left click, it'll automatically warn me that it's already set it by saying now set
oh, I see down
the start.
here. Okay.
Right. So, and I'll go and finish this out by creating what's called a capped corner at the, because I think the bottom of the wing here is going to be severe enough that I have to do what's called a capped corner, which is a 3-part corner. We're not mitering 2 pieces into each side. We're actually going to wind up tapering into a 3rd triangle that's a little bit on the wide side, but it winds up working pretty nicely. So my drawing here is getting a little sloppy, so I'm just going to clean this up a little bit. Oops. It may continue to draw the next shape, so it brought it up from where I left off. Just hit the delete key. That's because I missed picking this up. So I'm going to draw that shape and leave it like that. Hit stitch it. Start where I left off. Oops, stitch it. Start where I left off and where I'm going next. And here comes what's called the capped corner. I'm going to use the column tool and just kind of draw the cap. Now, and then I'm going to taper it down like this. So the stitching will kind of go like this, and then kind of turn and then taper down to this little point here. So I'll hit stitch it, set my starting point here, and I want to actually wind up back here so I'm ready to do my ending point. So this is going to taper here. It's going to be, this is not good for wide corners because it suddenly goes from maybe a 1.5 millimeter wide to about a 3 millimeter wide. So if you go from 1 to about 5 or 2 to about 7, that can be pretty bad. And also the pull compensation here is a lot, so I'm going to reduce that to maybe 5, so it doesn't stick out. In fact, I'll not even put it in there, and then see how that meets up a little bit better. And then we'll just finish this wing shape out, and we'll end the lesson there because it gives us enough of an idea, since this is kind of repeating shapes and everything's going to be the same when I draw the face detail and the owl.
I really appreciate this. I've learned more in this hour than
we don't get to teach this often, and that's kind of why we want to create videos like this so that you can actually do some in-depth digitizing and see what the capabilities of the program are. We would like to see a lot more people using this program for what it really can do. It is a very competent digitizing system, and we've worked a lot more expensive digitizing programs, and for what this is, it actually really does very nice quality output. Looks like that's speeding up nicely. And we're at 1,000%, so if we're meeting it, if it looks good at 1,000, it's going to look good at 100%. All right, so again, actually, typically I don't zoom any further than 600. That's the old digitizer's maximum. Start, and then now we can do a cut if we want to go ahead and finish this out. I'm actually going to finish, save this since we've gone this far. Okay. Then this is just a similar exercise. The only thing that's kind of different here is that we got pupils that are going to be continuous circle that are filled in. What I do is just kind of taper from one tiny end to the other. And kind of do it that way. Now, what are you going to do about the gap here? What I would probably do is I'd put my ending point maybe somewhere inconspicuous, and then what's going to happen is when I create this satin stitch, it's going to just kind of jump off here, and that way I don't have to have a trim. Now I got to figure out how this is going to meet. I probably want this to sew last or appear like it's going to sew last. And the V of the face, that way it looks like it's on top of the V of the V here. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. So I may actually change my sewing sequence here. So I'll do, well, then again, let's try and make this, true, almost cutlass digitizing. As we'll do this next, but I'm going to create a little overlap tab. That's what we're going to do. So we're just going to draw this. Nice thing about circular objects is if they're perfectly circular, you don't have to draw a point but every 90 degrees. And it will automatically make the nice curvature for you. Now here's where my overlap tab comes in, is I'm going to put a little tab out like that. And again, 0 key to join. Still had to adjust a few shapes.
Now, can you take that and mirror image it to the other one?
I could, except I'm going to make this, but it would force me to add a couple of cuts. So I'm going to try and do this cutlass-wise. But yes, that is definitely an approach and totally legit. I would do it that way too. In this case, I just kind of challenged myself and to say, let's try and do this without any cuts. So I'm going to stitch it, start where I left off here, end over here, and I probably want to edit this a little bit so that my stitch angle looks similar to where the nose is going to take off, and then I'm going to just create a tapering miter here like this so that maybe it doesn't really look like and otherwise I'll probably make this a mitered corner too. Might as well finish this out, right? So start here and here, or maybe even a mini capped corner. Start there and where I started. And you're right, I'm gonna follow your idea, copy it, paste it, and right click flip horizontal. But now I've got to reverse my starting and ending points. So because this one starts up here and ends down here. So just go to editing, and I'll hide the image here so you can see this in the stitching. The end point is the left facing arrow, the starting point's the starting point's the right facing arrow, the end point's the left facing arrow. So I'm just position and then hit enter. That
so that would eliminate a jump.
Exactly. This is definitely not your first rodeo, like like we were saying.
I've never done this before, but it's the same is in the sewing world.
This is, you obviously know quite a bit about or have some really good instincts either way. I'm going to completely take your idea. I'm going to copy this too. I didn't think I could, but it looks like we can. Paste it, and again we'll just reverse our in and out points. And then we'll copy this too, so we'll totally cheat. And to make them not at the same angle, but at mirrored angles, I'll also flip that horizontally. So, and I want to make sure, for really good pathing, like you said, good pathing ethics, is we want to edit and make sure our starting point, the start point here, we want to make this here, and then the end point, we want to make it here. And then I want to make the start point for this here, and it doesn't matter where the end point is since it's the last stitch, but I'll put it up here. And now we have almost completely trimless In fact, I think this bird is completely trimless. So if you redraw design, and if we watch the path, it should go completely without crossing itself over or cutting and going in the middle of the space. This is just jump from center. So, it does trim once, of course, to do the face detail, because there's no way to kind of path across. There's your one trim.
There's your one trim, yeah.
Right, exactly. And that's it. And I'll go ahead and save that. And we've got a design done. Okay, last thing is when you save a design, go to design, center the design, which puts this whole thing, hoop centers the white dot here, hit OK. That'll move it a little bit in case we were off, and then go to design, apply fabric, and then pick whatever. In this case, this is going to be a sweatshirt. I'll do a medium jersey, hit OK. Stitches count actually went down just a little bit, and pull compensation density and underlay is all now perfect for a sweatshirt. That's pretty much it.
Wonderful. Oh, thank you so much.
All right, thank you for sticking with us as we did this whole lesson.
Yeah, and I was the only one here.
That's all right. It wound up being very useful for a few people anyway. So this really